Near the end of the 19th century, just as the glory days were waning for gold and silver mining in the Rocky Mountains, an unlikely savior appeared on Colorado's plains in the form of a homely root vegetable that would revolutionize modern farming, industry, and culture with its abundant stores of sugary energy.
There's no denying it. Sugar beets saved Colorado.
It's bigger than anything that came out of the mines.
White gold, all of that sweet, sweet beet sugar replaced gold and silver as the core of our economy in the early 20th century.
All this land that you see here was purchased with sugar beet money.
It was just hard work.
They're ugly. Sugar beets are ugly, but it's amazing the sweetness it hides is really the core of its value.
It was this irresistibly sweet force of nature that reshaped the state's built landscape of beet farms and sugar factories.
For sugar beets, the industry and the agriculture are just intertwined. It's a useful aspect of Western history to contemplate, that it is not agriculture or industry, or agriculture versus industry. It's really the two things fitting together.
While serving an all-consuming agribusiness of beets over decades of growth that were followed by days of decay during the headlong course and crash of Colorado's white gold rush.
This program was generously made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
The roots of the humble white Beta vulgaris run deep in the human history of agriculture as a subsistence food for peasants and fodder for animals, but also as the subject of so much scientific research to purify this sucrose-packed plant into a precious nutritional commodity that would allow an American empire to amass wealth and flex its muscles. And in less than a century of sweet success and bitter toil, Coloradans cultivated the common sugar beet into a champion cash crop.
Sugar beets stand for a lot, more than most people will realize.
We started growing sugar right at the moment that our precious metal industry collapsed. Gold and silver mining were done by the end of the 1890s, and something had to fill the economic gap, or Colorado was simply going to stagnate. And what filled that gap was sugar.
Many of the same movers and shakers behind the mining boom became the original boosters of Big Sugar.
It is pretty amazing that just, 6 or 7 or 8 years after the gold and silver rush here, a few people are going, beets, how about sugar beets? And they start talking beets.
But it was all talk and no manufacturing.
Because we didn't have factories, the beets that farmers were growing were mostly used as livestock feed. They were being used to feed cattle and sheep. They weren't being refined into sugar.
Until a true beet believer, with some academic backing, attracted the needed seed money to begin building the sugar infrastructure.
Peter Magnus was a farmer of Swedish descent who came to Colorado in the 1860s, and he's really considered the father of sugar beets. He understood that there was another potential for sugar beets, and that is in refining the sugar. And so, working with scientists from the State Agricultural College, Magnus began convincing Denver investors that their future lay in sugar.
They began to realize the beet could be weighed in the balance, as if its sweetness was as good as gold or silver.
The agricultural scientists who are interested in cultivating sugar did their first quality testing of sugar beets at the Denver Mint, a place where prospectors brought their gold samples to assay their value. They used the same equipment to assay the value of sugar. It's a good symbol of the transition between gold and silver wealth to this new sugary wealth, this sweet future for Colorado.
Which was like candy to some savvy investors, But changing raw beets into white gold would require the special alchemy of the Boettcher touch.
Charles Boettcher. He is so involved in so many aspects of Colorado's economy. We wouldn't have an economy without Charles Boettcher. He started as a hardware merchant with a hardware company that had the slogan, hard goods, hardware, hard cash. Boettcher was smart enough to realize that the silver boom wouldn't last forever, and he began looking around for an alternative way to stimulate Colorado's economy.
Then, in legendary Boettcher fashion, he brought home some souvenirs from a grand tour of his native Germany to sow the seeds for a flourishing of the great Western Sugar Company, which would dominate Colorado and the nation.
And the story goes that he took one of his wife's suitcases and threw out all the clothes and filled the suitcase with sugar beet seed, which he brought back to Colorado to begin experimenting with this new cash crop.
Where it also found fertile ground among fervent beet fanatics in western Colorado.
When the first settlers came here, they put in fruit, but these trees died from alkali at that time.
During the 1890s, the Grand Valley was really hurting economically. They needed something more than the fruit industry that was growing right then. So they were becoming more excited about the prospects of a sugar plant here.
Because the mineral-laden soil of loam, silt, and clay that starved most other produce was a feast for beets, which stored up exceptional levels of sucrose.
When they brought beets that were grown in the Grand Valley over to Lehigh to have them tested, they tested very high in sugar content, up above 13-14%.
The Western Slope was a beet-friendly environment that also attracted influential family and political connections.
Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson was invited by a relative here in Grand Junction, and he said, "Oh, we should definitely be raising sugar beets here."
Not only in Colorado, but also on American soil first and foremost, thanks to the good graces of the federal government during a foreign war against an old world power with sugar as one of the spoils.
You had the 1897 Dingley Tariff Act, put a high tariff on sugar, a reflection of the populist movement at that time and towards protectionism. And you had the Spanish-American War, which we were cut off from cheap cane sugar from Cuba. So by 1897, 1898, people were ready to invest.
And Grand Valley promoters were triumphant in raising enough money from their Denver connections for the chance to make sugar.
They managed to influence a number of other people to invest the necessary capital to build Colorado's first sugar beet plant here in Grand Junction.
In the name of the newly formed Colorado Sugar Manufacturing Company, although some Front Range naysayers had their fangs out over the location.
The people from other parts of the state were kind of envious of Grand Junction being chosen as the site of the first factory.
Which local backers hailed as a crackerjack plant, jam-packed with newfangled gadgetry, represented today by one remaining sugar warehouse that's star-studded in the style of those times.
It had 6 or 7 huge coreless 150-power engines running the whole plant and improved centrifuges, and it was larger than a football field and rose more than 3 stories high. It was quite a sight to see, and it was probably very noisy.
Except in the fall of 1899, when it was too quiet during the early calamities caused by Bible-like plagues and human failings.
It wasn't until mid-November that year that they had finished it. So there were already major problems with the first sugar beet crop. They had flooding that year, then they had a drought, and then they had problems with bugs. They were being rushed to get the beets out of the ground, and a lot of them froze in the ground. So it was really a disastrous first start for the plant.
With the added catastrophe of amateur farmers who didn't want to get down off their high horse to join the real work of beet growing.
Charles Boettcher was complaining about those cowboys out there wanted to raise sugar beets off horseback. And maybe he placed too much blame on the farmers, but it is true that a lot of the farmers weren't fully aware of all that went into raising sugar beets.
Sugar beets are needy plants. That's what they are. They require lots of attention and care and cultivation.
And you need water. And you need a lot of water. And these early visionaries in Colorado who were thinking about possibilities, they were quick to recognize irrigation would have to be part of the story. This is not something that you can put the sugar beets in and then begin hoping for rain.
The entrance of the federal government into reclamation projects, irrigation projects, made it possible for people to realize these big dreams of sugar beets.
Along with providing a controllable flow of water for the thirsty beets, the owners needed to open the floodgates on a workforce of immigrants.
Sugar beets constantly demanded new supplies of laborers to come into Colorado, very often immigrant laborers who were sort of at the bottom of the economic scale and would be hired to do this labor-intensive, back-breaking, hot, sweaty, agonizing at times kinds of work. Beginning with the German Russians, who developed sugar beet cultivation in Europe in the early 1800s and brought their intense knowledge of sugar beet cultivation with them when they came to the United States.
It was an expertise and a work ethic that ran through entire families.
Both sides, everybody grew sugar beets. German Russians growing sugar beets.
And farming their way up from seasonal field hands to tenants, then owners, from one generation to the next.
Really, the property has been farmed for about 100 years by my family.
Who were able to stake their claim to a historic Wells County home place that had some unexpected comforts for a stucco structure, assembled from salvaged silos.
Our family farm was designated in 2009. In 2009, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And also that automatically listed it on the Colorado State Register of Historic Properties. This house was originally my grandparents' house. It was built in 1926, and the story is it was created from 3 silos that were torn down and the bricks were used to build the house. It's kind of amazing to think in 1926 it had a heated garage, it had indoor plumbing, and it has a whole room downstairs for the furnace because it was run off of a coal furnace at that time.
The road to a Colorado home for Hispanic beet workers traced a twisted and turning trail, from conquerors to refugees, settlers to citizens.
We go back in the San Luis Valley, 1840, my great-grandpa, that was even before Lincoln. Spain was a very influential nation and send explorers, and explorers come in through California, they come in through back east, and they come in through Mexico. And we were one of the last group of conquistadors that came directly into the San Luis Valley.
It was during the Mexican Revolution, and Grandpa didn't have any work whatsoever. So he heard they were hiring people here to work in the U.S. So they went from Zacatecas to El Paso, Texas. And then that's where they came across there. Dad says when they got here that they went to work right away in the sugar beets. He says, and I think at the time they were thinning sugar beets. He said it was hard work, but something they had to do.
Around 1920, a spokesperson from Holly Sugar was asked about the Hispanic laborers, and he said, well, without them, we'd be out of luck. Because many white people just do not want to do that kind of intense labor.
Which was an essential but very medieval form of manual stoop labor.
We had 2 hoes. One had a long handle, one had a short handle. And when I get tired standing up, I get on my knees and use the short one.
And you were bent over to block the beets and pull out the doubles with your fingers, And it was hard work, and so I told my mom and dad, I said, when I get big, I'm going to plant enough sugar beets that I won't have time to thin them myself. I'll hire people. And it so happened.
The situation for children in the sugar beet fields was heartbreaking. You grew up very fast as a child in the sugar beet fields.
There were few laws against children working along with their family, earning their keep, even at the expense of an education.
They had little kids out there helping them. maybe 3 and 4 years old, you know, because Mom was out there too. So they might as well help.
I was 11 years old when I started working in the sugar beets. Me and my family, all of us, and even my little brother, who was only about 7, he was working. He would throw sugar beets on the truck, you know, about one at a time.
Rural schools were forced to record the attendance of students as absent beaters versus present non-beaters.
There were a lot of children that would not show up for school daily or would leave during certain parts of the day in order to go work in the sugar beet fields.
Social crusaders, like the photographer Lewis Hine, documented the scandalous conditions of child laborers in the Colorado fields performing dangerous operations such as topping beets.
Well, the sugar beets were there, they're already loose, and we'd go down and pick one up with a hook and put it on your knee and chop the leaf off. Be sure you didn't hit your hand, then throw it in the row here, all the way down, you know, all the way down.
The sugar companies, in their economic wisdom, realized they should encourage itinerant but skilled workers to winter over and become permanent residents by offering them housing in their own colonies, or colonias.
Holly was one of the first companies to have the idea of providing housing nearby for sugar beet workers. And here in Grand Junction, around 1921, they built 2 longhouses down near the Grand River, Colorado River, that had roughly 20 units in it altogether.
I just remember La Colonia very well because it was a row of buildings, just one row, and they had an opening in the middle. And there was 2 rooms to each apartment. There was 10 to each row. And they had 1 water tap for the whole. And there'd be as many as 10, 12 families, people in 1 2-room apartment.
The colonies had their advantages over temporary tents or makeshift beet shacks. But neighborhoods, known as St. Petersburgs, jungles, or ragtowns, often segregated some already outcast minorities.
But I heard many stories about people from that community going downtown, and some places would have signs up, no Indians, no Mexicans allowed, whites only. That's why it's, I think, really hard to find old photographs of the La Colonia, because nobody really cared about it, and it was sort of, in a way, symbol of poverty, of economic desperation.
And a blight for many communities to be bulldozed or burned down once the colonia had outlived its usefulness.
Of course, La Colonia is no more.
Although some notable workers' homes in Fort Collins were preserved to receive a new lease as a livable history for the heirs of the beet era.
They're known as Alta Vista, Andersonville, and Buckingham. Those are little neighborhoods, very carefully defined with small houses, and that's where the sugar factory workers lived. Both those who worked in the factory itself and also many who worked in the area sugar beet fields. The 3 neighborhoods around the sugar factory are still occupied as residential neighborhoods, affordable housing, and they are still intact. And many of the people who live in those houses are descendants of former Great Western Sugar Company employees and also folks who worked on area farms.
Factory employees and farm folk who profited from peak beet production during times of war and periods of plenty, when the forces of big sugar trusts created an agricultural industrial juggernaut, unstoppable in battling for the prize of white gold.
In September, you would see what the beet workers called the beet campaigns, because this is the time, it's like a war. You're racing the clock to top the beets, to pull them out of the ground, to get them to the factory before they start rotting in the fields. There were factories in Longmont and Greeley. There were factories in Swink and Holly. There were factories in Grand Junction, factories in the San Luis Valley, in Alamosa, to process the sugar beets.
By gravity feeding them on a wild water ride down through a battery of torture chambers that paddled, tumbled, sliced, and juiced them until they were literally beaten to a pulp, then separated from their essential syrup, which was shocked into the finest white sugar crystals. The unforgettable odor of a hard-won beet harvest could only be described as the sweet smell of success by those who had fought for it and made their living from it.
The beets are brought in and they're boiled down, and the smell of it is ferocious.
There was a waste, you know, the stuff that they couldn't use for sugar. So they had what they called a pulp pit. And that's where the waste went, and they called it pulp.
And it was real smelly.
If somebody got it on their shoes or on their clothes and they brought it in the house, it was not very funny. So, but yeah, it was stinky.
People who worked in the industry said that's the smell of money.
It smelled just like bread and butter, you might say.
But the industry's tasty-sounding lime slurry was actually an obnoxious and unavoidable waste product of sugar making.
What that contained was crushed lime, acids from the sugar refining process, and boiler ash. Those were the primary constituents of the effluent.
In 1926, the Fort Collins factory chose to cross the Cashlaputa River with a surprisingly elegant suspended train pipe designed for sluicing industrial sewage as far away and fast as possible.
It's the Great Western Sugar Company Effluent Flume and Bridge,
which earned a designation in the National Register of Historic Places for its importance to the sugar beet industry, along with a reputation as a new Brooklyn bridge and an earlier version of a more picturesque Colorado icon.
The bridge here was actually built 3 years before the Royal Gorge Bridge. So this is one of the earliest suspension bridges in the state of Colorado. This bridge really represents the intersection of agriculture and industry in Colorado and the way that played out throughout much of the 20th century.
All in, an amazingly airy design for handling the heavy weight of waste it had to carry for over 29 years, and it has outlasted its factory.
You're talking about 250,000 gallons of water use a day in a sugar factory, and that's all resulting in something of that sort of number coming out at the far end in waste product. In 1955, when the factory shut down, the bridge was basically abandoned and has sat here ever since then in what has become now a city natural area, and only a few people really knew about it for many, many years.
By the 1970s, Colorado's solid standing as a premier beet sugar producer had been shaken to its foundation because of free trade for imported cane, expensive fuel costs, limits on immigration, and stricter environmental regulations, all sealing the fates of factories and the fortunes of farm families.
Sugar beet production rapidly declined, and these great sugar factories that dotted the plains, that dotted the western slope, began to close down one by one,
leaving behind the battered but hallowed remains of storage towers taller than the pyramids, smokestacks like mute minarets, and factories empty as temples once animated by the spirit of sucrose.
It really stunned so many families here in western Colorado. They had relied heavily on sugar beets. It was the only crop that they could have pretty much a guaranteed price when they put the seed in the ground. A lot of people felt sort of betrayed by the Big Sugar.
A betrayal on a scale that maybe only Big Sugar was capable of manufacturing. As the deliverer of a scientifically refined and subtly intoxicating commodity that can reward a sense of pleasurable dependence with the adverse consequences of addiction, sickness, or withdrawal.
White refined sugar just has so little to say to us about its history. It's not responsible to have the sugar without thinking about it. And the understanding of what it has meant to human society and to human organisms over centuries.
And what the price of sugar has both offered and cost the men, women, and children of Colorado's prairies and river valleys, whose bittersweet memories still come in a rush from bygone days when they were thankful for the gathering of the white gold that gave them a harvest and a home.
There's no sugar beets now, but we sure have missed them. It was a lot of togetherness. You didn't want to have your beet be caught with a real cold weather and you couldn't dig them out of the ground. They'd freeze in there. So other farmers would come to our farm and we'd go to others, you know, and we'd help each other. The farmers would get together and we have a banquet. Everybody would celebrate and bring the people together. And that is good for the valley.